That's cool. All right. Awesome. So, yeah, I'm very glad that we were finally able to chat live, not just asynchronously on Voxer. And I just want to give you a bit of context for as to why I think it is actually, there's actually a reason for us only connecting now. And that is, in a nutshell, the way I would describe it is, it feels like my instrument is attuned now. And I've been experiencing for the past 5 days now at this point, or something like that. I don't know if like Kundalini awakening is the right word, or like what term to use to describe it. But essentially it feels something like heart energy just bursting open, and yeah, there is some sense of alignment, creativity, vision, clarity. Clarity is the main word. And it's been really intense in a beautiful way. And I'm noticing also like a meta awareness of like, okay, maybe this is also just a manic phase, and I need to like just remember to meditate every day, and just hopefully I don't crash after whatever this is. But this, like, I've had sort of manic phases like that before, but this sort of feels different. This is like a whole new level. It sort of feels like I had this image of like a Pokemon evolving to another level or something, or like it feels like, I don't know. And so in any case, I reached out to you and also to Jordan, and it's especially you two, like you two guys, because there's a difference in the way that, like, when you speak to me, you instead of speaking to me here, you're now speaking to me here directly. It's like literally a different sensation. And I haven't now gone to read, you know, your books or anything since then, or the Tao Te Ching. I want to reread now, like with this new perspective. But yeah, that's what's up, and that's yeah, I'm happy to have this conversation, just for you to perhaps, I don't know what, if anything comes up when I share that, or if you experience something similar, or yeah.
In this moment, I'm experiencing gladness and thankfulness that you're sharing this with me. I appreciate that. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like there's a ton of different directions we could now go and chat about. I'm curious, do you have any curiosities, or is there anything alive for you that you are currently interested in?
I'm curious as to your journey. I'm curious as to your life and what you are carrying, what you are drawn to become, and just the overall sense of the path that you are on, so that I can perhaps be of service.
All right. Yeah, let's see. Okay, I guess I'll just give like an intro to me, because I've never really done that with you. So And it feels weird to say the narrative of the story the way you're just used to sharing the narrative of the story, but it's still useful at times because it contains factual information. But I was born in California, uh, with a German mom and a Swiss dad, and lived there for 10 years in the Bay Area, then moved to Switzerland, uh, where I lived for 10 years, then studied in the Netherlands, and now I'm back in Zurich. So this is a geographic history. And more specific to the path, I would say I started meditating at around 16, so quite early, and went down the rabbit hole of Alan Watts very early on, but was always exploring it very deeply on my own. It was always a very, very personal thing, as it perhaps tends to be. And that then evolved into, Sam Harris, then exploring Buddhism, and just deepening this meditation practice. And was there an in between? No, at some point, early pandemic, towards my final year of studies in the Netherlands, well, to be completely honest and transparent, I came across truffles in the Netherlands, and had my first psychedelic experiences, and that just opened up a ton of doors, I'd say, especially discovering them, let's say, like 5 or 6 years after this like consistent meditation practice. I was like, oh shit, this is like made for me, because they're so like compatible. And so I started like microdosing and had like this whole like exploration phase, also by myself. And during that exploration phase, that's when I first came across Game B, metamodernism, the whole liminal web rabbit hole. And I then, during the pandemic, went super deep into it. It was a great time to explore, this type of work. Discovered Daniel's work, and Daniel, just from the beginning, was just like I don't want to say like a brother from another mother, but like a person. When I was just bound, like I was just like mesmerized by the clarity of his thinking and his speaking. I remember very early on, and became like a bit of a fanboy and all this stuff. And only later on did I discover, like, I guess, the wider liminal web and just the whole range of thinking that's going on there, and just, yeah, how exciting it is. Anyways, there's a lot to say about that particular part of the path, I'd say. But in any case, at some point that became too much. Like, I was being distracted and not living like in my own reality. It was like very in the virtual, having a lot of Zoom calls, having like, very vulnerable and in-depth moments with people all over the world on stoa calls, or like, I don't know, like having a virtual tribe, which was great, but then I was neglecting the people around me in the real world. And so at some point, that dissonance like caught up with me, and I just realized, oh shit, I want to now put away the computer and live in the real world and enjoy the summer, and like, meet people here in Zurich, because I just recently, like a year ago, moved here. And And so I did that and just distanced myself from the whole liminal web space for a while. And then uh, over the span of the past few months, sort of discovered regenerative finance, so the refi space in the Web3, in the larger Web3 space, and thought like, basically I was torn down by, like I had lost some of my faith in life, and sort of I couldn't see a way out of Moloch, out of this downward spiral that we're like stuck in. And I'm like, okay, where do I believe is actual systems change possible? And I and I know, like, you know, you sent me that recording of the layers that you were describing and how you're focused on the cultural layer, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there. And I genuinely believe it is also on the cultural layer that systems change, or like effective, like it's more effective to spend your time there. I'm with you on that. However, I think, so in any case, I had to, okay, I'll add a little piece if that's okay. Just a little piece to, because I think it's important. Because I spoke to Jared Lucas yesterday. You know Jared?
I do.
And I shared this with him, and I felt like it's an important piece. So like for the past 3 years, 3 or 4 years, I've been going through like these expansions and contractions, I would call them. So like, I mean, in the mental health world, you would maybe call it bipolar. But I see it more as like going with the seasons a little bit as well. So like springtime, summertime, right around now, there's this crazy like creativity and flow and energy and drive and motivation and vision and all this stuff. Like I'm used to this time of year bringing about this state sort of. And then in the autumn, winter time, it just goes down. And so I'm constant, like, you know, there's like this over the span of a year, a quite reliable up and down in my overall well-being. I know that's not very precise. I mean, I can also find well-being when in the lower states, but it's more difficult at times to keep the perspective.
You might just actually be in tune with the seasons, you know.
Yeah, it could be that. And I never really took vitamin D in the winters in the past, and this is something I will now try, and hopefully that will help. But in any case, like the past 6 months were tougher and darker than usual, or like than I ever have experienced. Not necessarily because of like negative thoughts or like, you know, depression per se or anything like this, but mainly because my batteries felt drained. My life energy was like zapped. It was gone. And by this, I mean also like sexual energy, life force energy, you know, the creative energy. For the past, like since October last year until basically a week ago, was just like gone. And I tried so many things to get it back. Like I tried everything and nothing worked. And so it wasn't a depression of like, oh, the world is fucked and blah, 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 blah. More like, um, um, the most meaningful, or like there's something about the way I understand the world in which life force energy plays a very important role. That's maybe as precise as I can get. And uh and for then when I noticed like, okay, that's not there, and what resulted in that, there were a lot of lessons learned. One of them is actually from you. Like there's a part of, I don't know, I think it's in the little book, but also in the ethics book, of like, don't be attached to a certain form. And that's what was happening. It was like I was like trying to get back to the certain form of how it was expressing itself, and that attachment to that form, that was causing like a ton of the suffering. And as soon as I let go, like actually fully let go, it started to flow again. And so in any case, okay, what I'm trying to say here is that the way I described it to Jared yesterday is like, it genuinely, like the image that I keep on having is one of metamorphosis and the butterfly, and how I compare that 6-month drainage phase of my life force energy, sort of like the caterpillar dying and like losing all its life force energy, but it doesn't completely die because it still becomes a butterfly. But there's like, it's like basically it's still living, but it's like it's like a zombie sort of, because there's no life force energy. And then now, like this insane clarity and vision and abundance, like all this stuff all of a sudden has appeared, and at such another level that I'm like, this has literally been a transformative experience. Like I've taken psychedelics and it's been like, oh, okay, that was a transformative experience, but this is like, this is different. So yeah, that's a story. That's some context.
I'm glad. There are definitely elements there which I'm appreciating, definitely appreciating. So in this moment, are there, as you're holding this new awakening, this new energy and this new sort of creative impetus, what are you noticing that you're feeling drawn to? What are the kinds of things that you're holding enthusiasm about in the present, leading into the future?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot. But
So you don't have to describe it all, but what I would suggest that it'd be a very good idea to hold the feeling of that and to distill through it, to really feel the nuance of it, and to pin that so that you can remember it. Right. So in other words, to hold the state of that looking forward a little bit. It doesn't have to be far, doesn't have to be grand or anything. It just needs to be what is truly in you. Because right now you have access to a quality of perception. And it's very good idea to hold on to the memory and the feeling of this moment when you're holding that state. Because then there's an ability to sort of use that as a reference in the future. And there may be times, as the seasons do come and go, where it will be harder for you to remember what is now easy for you to access. So be wise with the fact of it being easy to access now, to make it easier to access in the future when you need it.
Yeah, yeah, last night I sent my, like, two of my spiritual mentors a voice message, sort of asking for an exercise for exactly this purpose of like, I'm feeling this sense of clarity now. What exercise can I do now in order for me to remember this when times are less clear and get, and I don't have this sense of clear and vision and clarity.
Did they answer?
Not yet. I mean, yeah, it's 6 a.m. or like 6:30 a.m. So yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to try to give at least some possible answers. I mean, I'm sure they'll answer in their own way, but I can suggest a few things that might work. One of them is a kind of a NLP, pinning it to the body, holding it in the physical relationships of, sometimes it might be some posture that you hold with your hand or with your, some part of your body that you touch that you don't normally do. And so in effect, it becomes a kind of reminder, sort of mnemonic. That's one path. Okay. So some aspect of meditation or physical poise or pose that can act as a mnemonic for the feeling tone, particularly the feeling tone of the enthusiasm that you have or you're carrying for the future. Right. So there's a sense of optimism that you're holding. And it's the feeling of that you're wanting to do. But the quality of remembering is going to be based upon a form. So in a sense, you're going to need to attach the feeling to a form. And though the form can't hold the feeling completely, it can remind you of the feeling. So that's a thing. Another form that you might work with is to write down a narrative or a poem or a sort of dream, like imagine that the future that you're feeling enthusiastic about was something that you were waking up and remembering a dream that you had just had. Like, first you just woke up a little while ago. And if you were keeping a dream journal, what would be the dream that you were remembering? So in other words, in the same sort of way that we would write down a dream with an emphasis on the feeling of the state, it's not always just the events that we're recalling. It's actually the events themselves are codes for an underlying feeling that is in fact the state of the dream itself. Dreams emerge from feeling and then become remembered in the forms. So the events themselves are projections, but in that same sort of way, we can use a narrative of a sequence of events to be evocative of a state of feeling. This is a lot of what steampunk or cottage porn or solar punk is sort of trying to do. It's trying to create an evocative sense of an optimistic future or natural future. And so at this moment, I'm gathering from the way that you're describing your current state that you have a sense of access to that. And that's something that, again, will be very helpful for you to be able to hold on to in a longer term sense. So it's two things, one that's somatic and one that's essentially potentially a written form.
So poetry, yes, I want to try that out 100%. I don't think I fully understand what the dream one. Like, am I envisioning the future as a dream and writing down what that dream would be, or?
Basically, yeah, as if it was a sleeping dream. So in other words, again, we're not trying to describe the future as this event, then that event, then that other event, as if we're literally expecting those events to come to pass. But along the lines of that this sequence of events, if I were to have experienced them, that it would create this sensation, it would create this evocative feeling. So in other words, to create the feeling that you are having, what sequence of events would you have to imagine the future having for you to feel the way you do now?
Okay. I think that's a useful exercise.
Yeah.
I quickly take note of that. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I get it just from like speaking to you now and listening to the voice messages that you sent, or especially that longer one the other day. That like again, I haven't opened the metaphysics or the ethics books, but my sense is that now when I read it, it's like clear on another level. Like it's actually like I have no idea how you managed to write this thing. I think you must have been in a similar state when you did, because otherwise it's impossible. Yeah.
I think you may be one of the few people to have appreciated that. Um, it sometimes is a wonder for me why more people don't ask that exact question. What was it exactly that you were experiencing somatically in order to be able to write this manuscript? I will say that it was somewhat exotic. No drugs were involved, but there was definitely an apparatus of meditation that was supplemented with copious amounts of computer science, of all things. There was a number of there were a number of exotic interchanges, and it took quite some time to develop the techniques necessary to do that sort of work. That itself is a whole story, is a whole narrative. It took years, many, many years. And one of the nice things about all of this is that having done that, I may have made it easier, or maybe even unnecessary altogether for anyone else to do the same thing. Now there is this material, and so it has an endurance of its own, now independent of me. So in that sense, I feel the effort has been wholly successful. There are for sure things that will be easier for you to relate to in a state of clarity, particularly in an energetic clarity. So as you come to understand more and more of the esotericism of any particular tradition, in this case Buddhism, each person that has studied very deeply of some spiritual path or some technical path, even people who studied very deeply in mathematics or science eventually get to a kind of appreciation of the deeper patterns out of which being itself is held. So in this sense, I think that as you are becoming considerably more mindful of the sorts of dynamics of how consciousness moves and how the world around you moves, right? The natural flow and cycle, that it will be increasingly easy to see some of the patterns of the metaphysics.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely have studied the ethics book more in depth and more often, at least, than the metaphysics. Um, I have, I sent this to you in a voice message as well. Like, I came across it, I don't know, the first time in 2020, 2019. And back then when I picked it up, I couldn't do anything with it. But then over time, like I remember I once read it after consuming some weed, and then I felt it, and since then, it's just over time it becomes deeper and deeper and deeper, and you just start to like, and and yeah, and it's just such a useful tool, essentially, right? Like, I mean, just even to know when to use the terms immanent, omniscient, transcendent is and to bucket stuff into those categories, it's incredibly useful. And the move that the transcendent is like right before the imminent, or like, you know, that move is like, that's beautiful, you know, that's
Yeah.
art. And yeah, so totally, yeah, I'm really excited to dig into it again when I
Well,
find some time.
let me offer you this then. You're clearly at a point at which this is a relevant thing. I do not know yet if you've encountered the White Book.
The White Book?
You're unfamiliar with those terms, and I will say no.
The White Book.
So there are different layers at which this manuscript is written. So when you encountered the Immanent Metaphysics and the Effective Choice as separate books, you may have noticed there are some places where it feels like there's a connection between the two of them. It is the case that there is a manuscript that is effectively those two books bound into one, where the connections between the two of them is made much more explicit. There's a lot more material in the White Book than is in either of those two other books combined. So I'm just going to tell you how to get to the White Book, since at this point it's abundantly clear to me that this would be something that would be very helpful for you. It'll make reading it a lot easier. It's actually the earlier form of the manuscript. The separation that was created between what is called the Immanent Metaphysics currently, and what is called the Effective Choice currently, was those were books created more for, on one case, an academic understanding, and in the other case, a more common sense point of view, right, that ordinary people would relate to. But in the sense that you're now encountering this material from the point of view of inner self and soul development, then it makes a lot more sense to see the integration. You're familiar with the mflb.com website. So to get to the White Book, because there's no direct link to it from the front page, I'm thinking of adding it, but at this point, it's been treated as something as a kind of need-to-know secret. So right after you put mflb.com/8192, so just the digits 8192, and that will pull up that manuscript.
8192.
Okay. Yeah, just right under the line, the address line, you know, mflb.com/8192, and that's going to give you, you'll see the glyph on the front, but it'll be obvious that this is, you know, it's a larger image of it, and then the text that's under it is essentially just a straight translation of that manuscript into HTML.
Yeah, I got it. Wow.
As you can see from the table of contents, there's a lot more material.
Okay, wow, that's amazing. More to explore.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned Daniel and Jordan, and what you might not know is that they studied with this material for quite some time. You know, there was the deep code work where they basically met with me, and we were ostensibly a small communication, a small collaborative context, although I later came to understand that they had their own projects. But in effect, part of the reason why there's sort of a strength in the voice that those people are bringing is because of the same material. It's because of the same work. So in that sense, you're encountering the enablement of this in multiple layers in various places through the liminal web at this point.
I know, like I know that it originates from here. That's why it's such an honor to also speak with you and to have this. I mean, you're just also so insanely generous, I feel like, with your time and your wisdom, you know, and so that's one thing that I also wanted to ask is like, I feel like you're holding a lot more that the world needs to uh that would be good to have in the world. At least this is my perception. And I'm
Oh,
curious if you can use some support.
yeah, actually, I could. I'm. It's this is this inquiry that you're referring to is something that's literally on my mind pretty much every day, and it's been even today. For example, I've spent a fair amount of time navigating my own energy around efforts and process to bring a much larger volume of this work forward. So, for instance, there is there's a huge amount of notes that have been taken over now decades, um, 3 decades worth of notes, not all of which got coded in the manuscript. In fact, very little of it has gotten coded into the manuscripts. Manuscripts were written 20 years ago. Like this white book that you just got access to is actually, I think this one was produced sometime around 2002 or three, maybe four. The manuscript from which it comes was done in around 99, 98, 99, 2000. And so, in a lot of ways, since then, I have, there's been occasionally new metaphysics work, but there's been a lot more application of this material in the space of what might be called civics, community process, culture, what I'm calling governance generally. And in this sense, there's a lot of new material that is still very much expressions of the metaphysics, but rather than being applied to an individual, which the effective choice in the white book is mostly written towards, it's now being applied very much to community process. And so there's a huge amount of notes about not just psychological processes related to individuals, but how psychological process connects to community process. And so things about existential risk as emerging from markets, as itself being a reflection of fundamentally genetic process. A whole bunch of materials that are expansions of how to think about the relationships of communication and what kind of implications that has. So, it's funny, you mentioned earlier in the conversation this whole thing about the multipolar trap and how do we navigate that. And one of the things that has come out of this work, which is at first, I was at one point years ago now, I was actually similar as yourself. I was quite despondent about future possibilities of the world. But now, in this sense, I'm actually more optimistic. My optimism at this point isn't so much as to whether or not there's a solution. At this point, I actually feel there is a solution. I feel that I've figured out a way. I have a design. I have an architecture, which I think, for a lot of not just speculative reasons, but for provable reasons, for very reasonable reasons, can actually be something that is far more humane in terms of how communities evolve and relate to one another. And so in this sense, it's now more a question about not where do we need to go as a species. And I feel like there's now clarity about where we need to go. There's clarity about the map. There's clarity about the compass. And there's clarity about our current position. And those are the three ingredients that are needed in order to be able to traverse time and space and possibility. And so in this sense, it's now a question of how do we connect that information to a broad enough consortium of individuals, for lack of a better word, to create a community that is an embodiment of these practices, an embodiment of these principles. of the metaphysics broadly, but also of its translation into things like how the ethics can be held. And so in this sense, I'm very glad to have recordings made. I make recordings. I've had lots of consultations, and as you said, I'm very generous with my time, but that's mostly because I actually recognize the sacredness of every person that's participating in this. It's very easy to be generous when you're with one's time, when you pretty much recognize the equality of life. And so in that sense, it's more the case of, can we find ways to bring more awareness about the whole depth of all of these concerns, these issues, these ideas, these enablements, methodologies, principles, practices. I mean, the entire cluster of this. And as a single individual who's frankly somewhat autistic, I'm constantly navigating how much energy I can. Sometimes I write codes to try to make these emails available so that other people can access them as essays. You probably noticed that on the website, for example, that I've basically been making in the last 6 months, maybe going on a year, that it's been like the last 9 months. I feel like I've really only been able to make a few changes per month, or add a few things here and there per month. But there was a time where I was literally creating a new essay or two, publishing a new thing or two every day. And for the sheer amount of material that is basically in kind of the wings, waiting to be published, waiting to have some time and attention devoted to them, to put them into a state that's presentable. Like I don't necessarily want to just post things without doing basic things like spell check or filter out the stuff that would be maybe less appropriate, or to add the details of things that I know but didn't spell out, would make sense to put in a document. So there's time involved in each thing to typeset it and to just make it something so that someone can read without, I don't know, misunderstandings for simple reasons. And so there's been some effort, particularly to develop kind of a series of tools and techniques and methodologies to bring some of this material to light. But at this point, it's kind of a handful of us sort of doing it as a volunteer project. I have an assistant who's more often running interference to make sure that I'm not drawn into doing things related to a business that's basically paying for my time. So it's kind of making sure that I actually get to focus on these kinds of things. There's a couple of other people that have gotten involved recently to help do audio management, to take audio recordings such as this one and make it something that would be more reasonably understandable. So question and answer format, typically. If you're wanting to get involved in that, I would be glad to have you. I mean, I wasn't expecting anything like that. I mean, I was just literally here to just help as best as I can with whatever you felt that you needed. But if you are interested in finding ways to bring this material, there's any number of things. Like, for example, helping people to understand what you've now come to know is a good thing. I mean, I would have you help people the way I'm helping you, if you wish. But I also would be glad to have any amount of support that you might be wanting to contribute in any of these other areas, depending upon what your natural inclinations are and what skill sets you want to bring to bear. I don't know how much time and attention you have available for this sort of thing, but if you are interested, I would be glad for help.
Yeah. Well, I mean, attention a lot, time less. At least at the moment. So at least until I'd say like mid-June, I'm very, very busy. But then I could just reach out at a time when there's more space, and then we take it from there, I would say.
You're under no obligation either. I mean, bear in mind that, the fact of a gift, you're welcome to just receive the gift And
No, I know 100%, 100%. And this is something I would do with pleasure, in my free time, because it's meaningful work. And yeah, so awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to. So I guess a question that comes up is like, I'm gonna do those two exercises, the somatic one and the writing one. And yet, like, this quality of being that I'm experiencing is so beautiful and like so like there's something about it I just can't, like, it's so, I don't know. And I'm curious, like, I have questions around, like, okay, does this last, this vision and this clarity, does this how can I make sure to, or how can I make this, like, ease into this to make this the norm, or like not the norm but just like the, like, how can this become sort of more of a baseline than this, like, really, you like this uh special state that it is. I mean, it's 5 days, right? And I have no idea, like, I'm super grateful. Maybe I should do a gratitude exercise just to, like, really be grateful for being able to experience this. uh that could also be a useful exercise, but I'm curious if, like, yeah, about that.
the clarity will more likely endure than the sense of mobilized energy. I mean, for everything that is in motion, I notice for my own sense that although I might feel more of the kind of energy that you're talking about now in the spring, that in the fall, although it is a more contracting energy, it still has its own beauty. It still has its own grace. So in other words, there's a sense, at least for me, of, even though there's a kind of contraction, there's a sort of nesting effect. There's a higher intimacy that can occur. There's a higher sense of privacy that allows for creativity to be less inhibited. And because I'm not as outwardly focused, going out in nature and spending a bunch of time outdoors, there's a sense in which I can focus and truly write. So I think that to some extent, it's not so much that it will always feel exuberant, but I think that what happens is that we begin to appreciate the full range of process and not have as much, again, I'm not talking about depression per se, but just that there's a sense in which the ebb and flow creates a kind of contextualization for life. That contextualization ends up becoming valued for its own sake. So in that specific sense, definitely have gratitude and definitely recognize that the clarity can move you to a somewhat cleaner set of energy flows. So it'll be easier to mobilize energy. It'll be easier to notice when your energy is being mobilized. But in that specific sense, it's not always going to feel manic. It will change state. Consciousness will always change state. It's inherent. The same way that nature abhors a vacuum, consciousness abhors stasis. So the energy will ebb and flow, but the clarity, the sense of insight, that can persist pretty broadly. I mean, obviously, there are things that can affect clarity too, but in that sense that clarity describes more of a sense of enablement, The energy can infuse the enablement, but the enablement is more basic. So in that sense, I would suggest that largely things are in pretty good shape, and might not need quite so much effort to try to maintain it so much as to fix the sense of feeling of it so that you have the clarity when you need it. That's part of the thing, is why I was saying really hold the memory of this, because in a sense you're going to want to carry the clarity forward for sure. The clarity you have now becomes the enablement clarity you'll have on ongoing. And in that particular sense, it kind of builds on itself. The clarity will always continue to build on itself. The more insight you have, the easier it'll be to have insight.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah, and I feel like a daily, just really staying disciplined with a meditation practice in which it's not like some sort of like focus on the breath type thing, but what I'm doing now is just putting my hands on my heart and on my lower chakra areas and just feeling, just that's it, and that also, when I came across your work, that's also something that shifted in my meditation practice, at least for a while. Like my intention every morning was to just move from head to body, and to start my day coming from down here rather than up here, because, and this is what's so crazy about it, at least to me, is I'm here, like I'm like really like a vessel that actually, like, it feels like there's energy flowing through here and it's hollow sort of here, and then it lands here, and then here is just so much aliveness and energy and everything, and then down here sort of as well. Yeah, and oh, so this is interesting, now that I was feeling into my body, that during those 6 months when I told you like the life force was drained, like I had a literal feeling and sensation, and even like sometimes image of there being like a hole in the bottom of this vessel where it was just pouring out energy, or like stuff was like just leaving my body, and I couldn't, and I wanted to close it because I wanted this life force energy again, but I couldn't close it. And now it's all different again, but like again, like with the butterfly metamorphosis analogy, I'm just, it's there's something to that. Yeah, so I appreciate the the advice for these exercises.
The thing that you just mentioned a moment ago is actually quite encouraging. So a lot of times when people teach meditation, they teach it as stop thinking. But what you've already noticed is that it's not so much about thinking or stopping thinking, it's actually about feeling and really landing in the feeling. And the notion here that is part of the reason that I'm suspecting, just listening carefully to how you're describing this, is that in the sense that you've become aware of your feeling, you've become aware of your care. Right. One of the essential things about the real teaching of this is that as we notice our feeling states, we begin to notice our values. We begin to notice what we care about. The energy of emotions is a series of pointers that bring us to an awareness of where love is. Right. So the sense of powerlessness, which is depression, is a pretty hard thing, but the thing that we feel that we can't act about is the thing that we care about. So somewhere along the way, we have to go from depression back to frustration, back to anger, back to fear, and then finally to love. Right? Fear is always going to be a fear of loss. It's something that we care about. Anger is energy projected into the outside world to try to get the outside world to change or to do something about what we care about. And so in effect, there's, as we go farther away from the love, the more unconsciousness there is. So the idea here is that the emotions become pointers back to the consciousness of what we care about, consciousness of love. And so from that space of being fully conscious of what we care about, what we love, what we're genuinely feeling in the connectedness is part of the reason why meditation is so helpful, because it moves us out of form and into feeling. We begin to notice the values rather than just the functions. We begin to notice the values. It brings us down into the level of connected meaningfulness. From there, we can make choices that are far more profound, far more enabling, far more beautiful, both in the sense of health and beauty and wiseness, the good, the true, and the beautiful, than we could through just an adherence to thinking about things. So, when you're saying you're feeling the energy in your heart, you're feeling it in your hara, right? It's the sort of belly. That in this sense, you have closed the gap in being aware that you care. Your care has landed. Now you're able to hold energy.
Yeah, and just hearing that, and again, just how clear, I appreciate the clarity in your in how you express. I always have, I mean, that's why these works are just so cool, because they're the most precise language that you could even use. And also, just as a side note, just for you to know, like after reading your works and also just listening to like podcasts or whatever with you, that was something that shifted for me. Like I began to really value precision with language, and to like slow down and like really try to find the right word to express what I'm feeling. Because it's an art to do that, right? And so that's a little side note. And I'm realizing as you speak, like that so much of what I learned from you over the past years at this point, and the whole liminal web space, I'd say like maybe 80-20, like 80% I like studied. It was here, it was like thinking, and only a small percentage was felt. And now it feels like I'm understanding you just on a whole different, like on a felt sense level. And yeah, it's a bit I mean, I have to breathe because it is very overwhelming in a way, and but in such a beautiful way. And I just, yeah, I could even cry. It's yeah.
I'm deeply appreciative. I'm really touched. I'm very glad, because as you may have noticed, most people think of me as some sort of outrageous intellect. And the irony is that my interior experience is one of feeling first and then thinking. Thinking to me is an afterthought. It's after feeling. The feeling is held first. It's the transcendent leading the immanent. And so I do not think of myself as an intellect. I don't experience myself thinking that much at all, actually. But I do find myself very much feeling all the time. And it's gratifying to me to have that be noticed. So thank you for meeting me.
Yeah. I have one other curiosity. I'm very curious about your relationship to marijuana, and how marijuana has perhaps influenced your journey. And maybe tobacco. I don't know if that's a topic as well, but yeah.
I haven't really done much with tobacco. I think I've only really experienced it maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. And it mostly gave me a headache. So I haven't really been encouraged to pursue exploring that relationship further. Marijuana has been, I guess, infrequently used. I mean, I don't actually do it very much, despite having a company that is extensively devoted to the practice. Um, in terms of my own personal journey, I think that my first experiences of it were, um, well, I can tell you a series of stories that would be maybe helpful. Again, I'm describing this as my personal experience. I don't expect that other people would have the same. But one of the things that was very much the case is that I think before I had cannabis the first time, I'd actually had it. A friend of mine had, I guess I don't know, maybe in my mid-20s. He wanted me to try it, and so he provided it to me a few times, and I was in his company, and the first 3 or 4 times I didn't feel it at all, and I came to have this somewhat maybe rude opinion that this whole thing was just like a complete farce, that everybody was sort of just making it up. I just wasn't having the experience. And so I began to wonder whether or not there was even a thing about that. It was just a social phenomenon rather than an actual experience. But the first time I did actually experience with this same friend of mine, it was a realization in the sense that it was as if I, for the first time ever, could actually feel and understand how most people were in the world. Prior to that, I had always experienced myself as just being very different. And it wasn't that I could really articulate the nature of what that difference was. And I still feel that sense. But at least in that moment, the first moment of my recognition of what it feels like to be quote unquote stoned, it was as if for the first time I could actually understand from the inside what was most people's experience of the world every day. So in one sense, whatever is going on to elevate people into this state of highness was essentially moving me into a state where I could actually experience what they were experiencing in their ordinary state of consciousness.
Quickly, for individual people, or are you saying people as a general whole?
People as a general thing. It was like for the first time, I understood what it meant to be human from the inside, for like the humanness that's the rest of humanity. I know that sounds a little weird, but this is just one of the factors that I've recently come to understand is associated with autism. So in this sense, it was hugely helpful because it enabled me to have not just compassion, but a sense of knowing with that compassion, right? Because to have compassion is a sense of breathing with. But while I cared, I didn't feel like I actually understood people's experience as they were experiencing it from the inside. Not until that moment. At that moment, it was like all of a sudden I felt like I got the kinds of trials and the kinds of difficulties and the kinds of things that most people were experiencing every day, but that I wasn't. I was experiencing different challenges. And so, in this sense, by understanding the kind of challenges people were ordinarily experiencing, I was able to have a deeper sense of compassion. So, I have to credit that cannabis genuinely helped me to be a more natural human being. And that experience continued to some extent, although again, I didn't experience it very often, but maybe 2 or 3 times a year. There was another group of friends that I had that were growers, and this was upstate Maine. And I remember that I would go visit them, and that the experience with them would be ones of profound laughter. Like we would just get into this sort of euphoric state where we would have the experience of just really enjoying one another's company and the way in which we made each other laugh, like deep belly laughs. There's a sense in which singing and laughter and joy are tremendously healing. They're powerful, transformative tools of one's state of health, of moving into a deeper state of health. It's like a kind of trauma resolution or a kind of healing that is occurring that is profoundly worthwhile. And so, in that sense, I came to associate cannabis with human compassion and with laughter and with good company, sort of community building company, at least in small groups. And so when I came to California, and this was a few years later, and I was moving out of what at that time was a prohibition state, where basically the only time that you could experience anything Maine was a little bit more open about it, but Massachusetts, where I was living at the time, was flat out, life sentence for a roach kind of thing. So the only time that you could really explore any of this with anybody was the most trusted friends, deep in the dark of night, hidden in like some part of the house that was not even near a window. Okay. Because it was deeply forbidden. And so in that sense, it was also kind of thing that again I associated it with really close, very familiar, extremely trusted people, because anybody in that group, if they ratted you out, would effectively be ending your life. Right? You'd be thrown in jail, and that would be it. So then I came to California, and California was like the complete opposite of that. It was like, you could light up walking down the street and nobody would bother you. And at first I was kind of freaking out. It was a little bit of culture shock. It was like, no, you're putting yourself at huge risk. I was like, well, actually, you're not in Rome anymore. You're somewhere else. You got to learn how to be with the natives. And so, in this sense, it was a real experience to feel that there was genuine freedom to explore this without necessarily having huge amounts of fear associated with it as well. So, and at that time, I was feeling pretty wrung out. I had a pretty stressful position working for basically the government, United States government, and so I was in a pretty disabled state, and so I was really just looking for a very simple project that would maybe provide just enough resources for me to actually spend time at festivals, i.e., to take and be in community. And so the part of the thing that selected the product or the company and so on was just that, given all of these associations of cannabis or marijuana and community process, at least in small groups, at least in somewhat intimate settings, not intimate sexually, but intimate in the sense of like truly trusted friends, that I wanted to have, some real concordance between the sort of ritual elements of how the material was used and the sort of creation of community process. So that became part of the reason why I set up Magic Flight as a company, is to promote that sense of community, particularly through herbal process. And at that time, I wasn't thinking just of cannabis. I was thinking much more of, the full range of herbs. There's a lot of different kinds of herbs, not all of which are psyche affecting, but some of them can be, particularly in terms of how the combinations work and things like that. And so I was very much hoping to have people become interested in herbalism more broadly, and through that to develop community process specifically. And so, in that sense, it was very much oriented around that sort of process. Now, what you might notice from my description here is that I wasn't thinking about cannabis as a tool for insight generation or creativity, although I had experienced some utility in that sense. But for the bulk of the work that I was doing, it wasn't because of cannabis. It was because of of just actually a sheer amount of effort associated with, again, this sort of weird combination of meditation practices and systems that I had written with the earliest versions of the internet, bulletin board systems and DeckNet and things like that. And so, in this specific sense, I came to basically regard it as a tool for connecting with people. And I think that, if I reflect on my learnings since then, so this is sort of how I held it, say around 2000 to 2010 or so. But in the context of actually developing it and really going out into the community in connection with Magic Flight Company and so on, I began to notice that despite my personal experiences with the substance, that it wasn't as community building very often, that a lot of people went into a very solitary sort of experience with it. And so I started looking more at things like Kava Kava as being a vehicle by which community could be created, rather than cannabis as being the primary way. But of course, at that particular point, Magic Flight, the company, had become very fully associated with cannabis because that was pretty much the only herb anybody was interested in. And the whole project of extending awareness into multiple herbs and really having people get much more in touch with nature fundamentally, that largely didn't happen. It did at least provide a vehicle for me to help navigate people into the space of philosophy a little bit, because printed on the back of each one of these devices is this notion: love is that which enables choice. And this sort of direction about love is stronger than fear and always choose on the basis of love. So in that sense, it gave me a means to publish at least a pointer back to this philosophy very, very widely. A great number of those units went out, and I continually hear that there are people who have come to love that instrument and felt that it was, very much something that they associate with good memories. And so, in this sense, I still have overall pretty broadly positive impressions of cannabis, but less expectations as to its utility for creating culture or supporting cultural process or supporting creativity process, and have largely switched to thinking about that much more in terms of process dynamics explicitly, things like ETP and group dynamics as mediated through more heart-opening substances. I had hoped very specifically that the cannabis could be used as a tool to help people to come into more caring and heart-centered relationships. But I think that overall, that hasn't been realized in practice. I'm going to plug my phone in because the battery's running out.
So what are more heart-opening substances or herbs? Like you said, Kava Kava? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, so this is, most of the ones that I know of are less well known, at least in terms of the open marketplace. But as a result, there's many of them are not restricted. They're just things. So Kava Kava is it's a tea. It's a drink. It's made from the lateral root of a bushy plant that mostly grows on the islands. Think Fiji or Hawaii and Polynesian islands sort of culture. They cultivate it as a drink. It's pretty bitter. If you go to Hawaii, for example, you can go to a kava bar. In fact, I don't think they're very common in Europe. Like, for instance, in the only place that I think that they're actually illegal is in Germany. But in most places in the United States and certainly in the Polynesian islands, it's treated just the same way that you might find, a coffee shop. And it's actually kind of bookend with coffee. Coffee will act as a way of waking you up and getting you sort of motivated to do work, whereas Kava kava is a little bit like what you would want at the end of the day to sort of relax, calm down a bit, and relate to your friends, relate to people. So in the islands, it's largely used in the same way we might use beer. Um, it has a anxiolytic effect. It has an anxiety reducing effect, which again in the indigenous cultures is something that you would drink before having a meeting or going into council, so that you would be more likely and more able to listen to other people and to really be in deep conversation with them. In this specific sense, people have come to associate it with focus and study and the kind of calmness that will enable the sort of council that we would want to have in a tea ceremony, for example. Another there's a whole range. I mean, bear in mind that there's a lot of different substances. Kana is another example of something that's regarded as a heart opener.
That I've heard of.
Yeah,
I think I may have even used. Yeah.
It's a little bit like MDMA or sassafras. Theobromine in chocolate, if it's an heirloom chocolate, can have a little bit of a heart opening effect as well. One of the key things about preparing cacao, which is the sort of original form of chocolate, is that you don't want to use dairy products with it because it will degrade the heart opening effect. In other words, the most chocolate that you buy is not going to be expecting. You're not going to be having a sort of empathogenic effect with commercial chocolate. So in effect, that's partly because the species is different. It's partly because of the way it's brewed. So to get the heart opening effect with chocolate, you're kind of looking for a very early ancient form of chocolate, and you're preparing it in a way that's pretty raw. It'll have some cayenne pepper and maybe ghee, but not dairy, basically. So in this sense, there's actually a lot of substances. So almost anything in the space of like there's different pharmacologies, like different psychedelic chemistry patterns. So things that are in the MDMA family tend to be more likely to be heart opening in general. I personally, I have relatively low serotonin levels in general, so I have to be a little more careful in terms of how I work with some of these substances. But I think that Kana, for example, has so far proven to be a good thing. Another one that's sometimes regarded as heart opening is Wachuma, the San Pedro cactus.
Like mescaline.
It's basically mescaline, yes.
That's funny that you mentioned that. I mean, I was about to bring up mescaline because I recently got a little bit to microdose with, and it's been nice. I mean, it's been like I don't do it regularly. It's more like, especially when I want to have a bit more energy, I feel like, because it wakes you up as well. And yeah,
for the most part, these sorts of substances, I think, want to be used in a context which is, in a small group, like 12 to maybe 20 people, or at least 6 good friends. Some context in which the encounter that you're having with these people that at least somewhat well, to be of good heart, to be of good spirit, to be interested and mindful, to treat these as tools for healing emotional woundedness, or healing social things that might be habits that we don't even know that we have. The degree to which these kinds of things can be transformative is something I firsthand have experienced. There's a lot of areas where I have become healthier, particularly psychologically, as a result of using these tools in a specific way. So in that sense, I'm actually a proponent of the more conscientious use of these tools for psychotherapeutic process, particularly. I'm certainly not the only one. There's lots of people who are looking into this in a sort of research way currently. Um, you know, I first of all, I should also just mention I don't consider myself to be expert in this area. I mean, I know something about psychedelic shamanism. I've been asked to teach occasionally with other herbalists in this sort of space, but for the most part, um, you know, there are people in the world who have made this their life discipline, and in this sense, I'm joining on to their knowledge rather than you know, trying to present it as if it's something that's new.
Yeah. um yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention is when you were talking about um music and trauma healing or something along these lines, like the I mean, to put it yeah, to be very clear, um I feel like I've hacked my Spotify algorithm, and my current music is, it's so insanely good. Like, it's really soul music, you know? And I found my music, and I DJ. That's one of my ways to express my creativity. And I'm like, I have like 100 new songs already that I'm ready to download and to start playing with. And like that physical, I mean, okay, physical is not the right word, but like the fact that I can refer back to this playlist, or like these several playlists that I created during this time associated with these feelings, I think is again already one of these exercises. I can just listen to the music, and and this is what I'm doing. I'm listening to this music constantly, like same tracks, new tracks, and it feels like it is my rule of life. Like it is the thing that keeps this experience going in a way as well, you know.
That's actually perfect. So let's call that the third exercise is connecting the feelings to music and having the music be a reminder of the state. This is actually a very good thing. I've also had music that I use that same way. And so yeah, in fact, this is perfect for you to mention this because I completely agree. And so much so, I'm now very curious to hear some of these playlists. I have a Spotify account. Please send me a link to some things you compose so I can subscribe.
Yeah, for sure. I'll send it along after.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff I would love to discuss, and I don't want to like take up too much of your time. It's already been almost 2 hours, like 1 hour 40. Or at least that's what my Zoom recording is showing.
Okay.
I don't know, how much time do you still have?
I probably shouldn't go too late just for the sanity of the guests. I mean, I'm in a house with other people, and so I should be mindful that they're going to want to sleep soon.
Okay. Then I mean, maybe another time we can have a conversation to unpack um, love is that which enables choice. Because I feel like unpacking the nuance and the complexity behind it, I don't know if complexity is the right word, but like the nuance behind it, I feel like I could, I would love to do that with you now, like to really open it up. But that's for another time. Maybe one thing that I would like to maybe still bring up this time, and then because it feels very alive, and you asked me like what am I oriented towards, and I never really answered. So I just want I'll share this project idea, and I just want to hear maybe, I don't know, any thoughts, I guess. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so by the way, you haven't, I told you this at some point, but you have an open invitation to come to Switzerland and to crash at mine if you want, and to just, yeah, we can go hiking, and I don't know, I'd love to show you Switzerland if you ever come. And if you do, my family, so my mom's an artist, like businesswoman turned artist, and Um, she had her studio in this really beautiful building in Lucerne in Switzerland, for like a year. And it was like the side room of a larger space, which had like, it used to be an auction house, and then it was like this. Now, I mean, the past years, it was like a pretty messy space and gallery in a way, but not with a lot of visitors, blah, 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 blah. And my mom kept on going to her studio there and being like, man, this would be such a beautiful place to have a gallery, like a clean and like a beautiful gallery and show beautiful art. And so one of her artist friends, a more famous guy, a Chinese artist, came by one time, and she just spontaneously was like, wouldn't this be like a super cool place to have a gallery? And he was like, yeah, I see it. And that started an entire project in which now, since 1 year, this space has become a beautiful gallery in Lucerne. Like, it's called Impulse Gallery. And my mom's basically her, and then like, there's two other people that are really running the whole thing. And yeah, there's like 15 artists. I can also share the website or the Instagram page or whatever with you, so you can get a sense of the art, because the common theme is like, it's very organic art, very nature inspired art, oftentimes interactive art, so that the artwork sort of changes depending on your perspective and stuff like this. So very cool stuff. And it's running really well since this first year, although there was a pandemic, like it was a better, like much better than we ever expected it. And yeah, context. So project. So during this 1 week in Austria, when I was at this regenerative finance unconference, I got like a crash course in finance, economics, blockchain, Web3, all of that. Side note, like that the Pokemon up leveling thing, it also comes from the sense of like seeing those, especially finance, like, and economics, being like an essential puzzle piece that I was missing in order to understand the way the world works around me. Like, I always saw finance as this really hard and weird, like abstract thing, and I never really got into it. And even when I tried, I was like, just not approachable. Like, I don't like it. And then after this week, like, I started to realize, oh, it's actually pretty simple and like makes sense. Like, you can get into the depth and the nuances of it, but that doesn't interest me whatsoever. I just like the yeah, the simple. So it feels like those puzzle pieces had to come in place, and then this whole like butterfly emerging or like up leveling, all that stuff sort of happened. Back to the project. I want to set up. Okay, so I know you're not the biggest fan of crypto, so I want to set up crypto payments for the gallery, which is a neutral thing, I'd say. And then I'm now looking into like art Web3 projects at the moment. And one idea that I have is that I want to get digital artists involved. So like AR artists, or, all these different digital art forms, to come to work with the artists that we have in the gallery, like my mom, and say like, hey, the feeling that you were trying to express when you were creating this artwork, because my mom has this very intensely as well. She also like, it's not her painting, it's the energy, and she has synesthesia, so she like, it's a whole thing. And in any case, like, to enhance that, like that they come together, and it's like, okay, how can we express more of that by bringing in perhaps a digital element? Okay, the digital element then becomes the NFT of the physical artwork. I, I,
I still don't see how any of this connects back to me.
yeah, I know. I'm coming there. I'm coming there.
Okay, be close, because again, it's getting late.
Okay, I'm almost there. Um, yeah, I see what you mean. Um, okay, I'll be quick. So because our gallery is already like self-sufficient, any income that we get from selling NFTs is basically like extra money in a way. And so some of it we would use for like operations or whatever. Another part, like 80% of it, of the income, I would see as going into a common pool where, you know, it's just a pool of resources, of liquidity. And I don't know the exact governance processes we would use, but like NFT holders would be able to govern over that common pool and fund regenerative art projects with it. And so with regenerative art project, I don't necessarily mean like art that uses like sustainable material or whatever. I rather mean, and this is what I'm trying to like express and get across. Okay, so things like permaculture or things like I don't know, planting trees or creating more livable areas for insects and butterflies, or the X number of projects that exist in that space of making our world more beautiful, right? By making nature more abundant and all of this, like framing that as the artwork or as the art project. So the art is regenerating the earth. Like the act of regenerating the earth is the art. And I want to use these funds to fund projects that are doing it in that frame. So like there's a story, there's a narrative also behind why I am now creating this beautiful location for the bees or for the whatever. And you know, there's like there's a creative dimension. Like there's a lot of potential there, I feel like. And I'm curious, I guess, about, well, maybe, I mean, in general, what you think, but do you know of any projects that sort of are like seeing like the act of regeneration as an artful act, you know, like,
Yeah, I
feel
do.
like you would. Yeah.
There's definitely, I'm reminded of something I heard about recently called Wild Vessel.
Wild Vessel?
Yep. There's at least a few projects actually that come to mind. I don't know the name. There's another one, I think it's called Black Mountain. There's certainly pretty much anything in the neo-paganism space. You know, earth-centered spirituality generally is going to be more oriented towards that. There's anything that is about rewilding.
Exactly.
That the term eco-eroticism comes up as well.
Oh, I like it.
There's a real reason for that connotation, by the way, which is that I view art in general as being largely connected to sexuality, and you know, music included. I mean, I'm basically just saying that as far as human relationships are concerned, there's far more about the attractiveness has a lot to do with just the attractiveness of beauty as being itself connected to a sort of mate selection process, for lack of a better word. Mm-hmm. And so in effect of looking at what's beautiful in nature, there's a wildness to it. You know, when you look at a beautiful woman, there's a wildness to it. So there's a sense here in which to really be an affirmation of that is largely to be in reverence of the land, to be in connection to ecology in a profound way. So in that sense, I'm broadly in favor. whether or not the notion of cryptology is or Bitcoin or NFTs or anything like that is fundamentally necessary to achieving those outcomes, well, that I tend to be a little more skeptical, only because, well, for a variety of reasons, but one of them being that it's infrastructure that is needing a tremendous amount of business coordination across continents to basically maintain. So it's actually quite fragile in that sense. The other piece that is largely overlooked when thinking about this is that when we're looking at consolidating money, like gathering to some repository or some bank or some, trust or something, that would be, the act of acquisition or of concentration or of collection, centralization is profoundly easier than the act of distribution or decentralization or disbursement. So to take resources that have been gathered through pretty much any process is going to actually be very challenging to find a way to have that money go to the margins, go to the places where rewilding would actually occur, rather than being diverted into any number of private interests or hidden dynamics that actually can make it extremely difficult to genuinely do disbursement. So in this specific sense, if it's already embodied and it's already dispersed, it's actually a good idea to just support it where it is, rather than to concentrate it and then to disperse it as a separate step. So those are things that I hold in mind as I'm thinking about this. But I think that to some extent it's not necessarily for me to critique too much, because obviously as individuals we can only do so much. So in effect, if you're trying to achieve a broader effect than can be done just by one person, then techniques like this could potentially be helpful. But I think overall I start to come back to, how do we have communities of people genuinely be in right relationships with the wild, to generally have the technology be in service to the wild? So broadly speaking, if you're thinking about NFTs as being, a vehicle of technology, which it is, and somehow bringing that into service of nature, and then I'm basically like, hell yes to that. But is it the right tech? Is the tech the right tech to use? Is what I would consider to be an open question. I get more excited, for example, about things like desalination projects, not because I want to create water for human beings, but because I want to basically make the deserts wet again, right? To maybe build mountains, to have some of this resources to create literally things that would shape the way in which winds move, so that the moisture collects in places that are currently barren. To develop whole new ways of thinking about the way energy is collected and distributed is I think an area that's also broadly of interest, or things that radically reduce the level of pollution, that increase social awareness around the beauty and the value of trees. So whether it's machinery that is helping us to create abundance in the land in one fashion or another, or to clean up the damage that has already occurred, I do definitely see a role for technology. But most of the time I see it as being much simpler forms of technology. So things that are easier to be maintained by communities, or easier to be used in a decentralized way. So as a result, a lot of times, rather than focusing on high tech, I'm focusing on what might be considered mid-scale tech. Basically, I'm feeling that pretty much all social problems could be solved with technology. Was invented before year 2000, and maybe even was fully embodied in '93. And there's a variety of reasons why I think that way. As a technologist, I've been pretty deeply involved in how engineering works, and I'm a very accomplished software engineer, so I'm familiar with the full range of capabilities that those things do and do not have. I know about artificial intelligence. I know how the dynamics of that mostly works, although I haven't chosen to really put myself out there as that kind of researcher. But in a lot of ways, I have a pretty nuanced perspective on the relationship between technology, humanity, and nature. And so in the sense, I really affirm the impulse that you have, and would just say, again, don't be caught by the form. The form can be, in this particular case, a vehicle that can certainly be in support of the wild and certainly be in support of nature. But I think that there may be better vehicles, and that if we're even more discerning about the qualities of how that comes about, that you'll find even more freedom in that. And one thing I'm encouraged to hear that you have recognized finance as being an important thing to understand well, because if you don't understand that well, it's pretty hard to account for broad swaths of human behavior. But in the sense of moving from extrinsic motivation, which is what dollars basically are, to intrinsic motivation, which is what creativity and art come from, then to some extent we're wanting to be very familiar with how that dynamic works. So learn about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, what can and can't be done with one or the other of those kinds of tools. This will be hugely helpful for you in the sense of understanding how to put together projects that, like the way that you're describing the artist studio and gallery and such like that. First of all, sounds really encouraging, and in fact, I would love to see it. It feels like it was well conceived, and so in that sense, I'm encouraging you to hold on to the qualities of what you're talking about, and to come up with ways to hold that as even more well conceived.
Yeah. I appreciate that reflection. There's a lot there, and I'm glad we pressed record, because I think in the future I'll be super glad to look back into this conversation, maybe during times that are less clear again.
Yeah.
So this is also an exercise, right? This also serves sort of a similar function of, when I'm like, when that inevitable time comes of just maybe having less vision again. I don't know if it's an inevitable thing. I don't, again, a bit imprecise maybe, but because you're saying clarity remains. Yeah, but this has been really awesome. This has been super useful for me. I hope it's been for you too. And I'm super glad we got to do this. Like, I'm really appreciative of it. And I mean, thanks for sharing the white book. I'm super excited to dive in there now as well.
You'll get a lot out of that, I think.
There's only a digital manifestation. There's no physical.
I have printed it. There weren't that many copies made. I think there was maybe about 200 of them. The last time I saw one on eBay, it was for something like $500 or $600.
Jesus.
Which was a little ironic to me, because I sold them at like 15 or 20. I'm thinking of doing another print of those, but I'm gonna run out the print that I already have of the effective choice before I start reprinting those books.
Mm-hmm.
There's some typesetting work I'm going to need to do to bring it up to modern book printing standards, but yeah, it'll come in physical form again.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it, and maybe we can unpack also the nuances and complexities of these several layers, ecological, cultural, infrastructure, because I am convinced that something like the tools that are shaping this Web3 space will be used for global coordination, but it rests upon culture, and to like unpack the nuance and like how those two relate to each other, the relationship between those layers, that I would love to explore.
Great. Well then, next time.
Next time.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you so much, Forrest.
All right. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
Okay.
All right.
Have a good evening.
A great day. They have a whole day ahead now.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to bed soon. So
all right.
have a good day.
Good morning.
Bye. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.